She was 18 years old and, for all intents and purposes, homeless. She had no family left who would claim her, no plan for the coming winter, and just a small hand-carved wooden bird in her pocket, next to $27 in worn bills. And with that meager sum, she laid claim to a ruin on the vast, empty prairie, the sealed stone cellar of her grandfather's first house, a place long since burned to the ground. But what nobody knew, least of all the aunt and uncle who had cast her out, was that sealed beneath the prairie grass was a legacy of patience and foresight that would change her life forever. Settle in close for this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Clara Hill had grown up in the shadow of her grandfather, Elias Hill, a man as quiet and enduring as the prairie itself. Her parents had been taken by a fever when she was 4, a brief and sorrowful chapter she only remembered in flashes of a woman's soft humming and a man's calloused hand. After that, there was only Elias. He was not a man for easy sentiment, but his love was in every lesson he taught her. He was a carpenter by trade and a naturalist by soul, and he raised Clara to understand the world through the grain of wood and the language of the wind. He taught her how to use a draw knife to shape a spindle, how to read the clouds for signs of a storm, and how to tell the difference between the song of a meadowlark and that of a sparrow. He taught her that patience was a tool, as essential as a hammer or a saw, and that there was value in things others saw as broken. Their home was the main ranch house, a sturdy 2-story structure Elias had built with his own hands after his first wife, Clara's grandmother, had passed. It was filled with the scent of pine shavings, drying herbs, and the faint, sweet smell of the pipe tobacco he smoked on the porch in the evenings. The object she carried in her pocket was his last gift to her. He had carved it during the final winter of his life, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but still impossibly steady. It was a meadowlark, no bigger than her thumb, its head cocked as if listening for a song. He had sanded it smooth with emery paper until the pine felt like polished stone, and had rubbed it with beeswax until it glowed with a soft internal light. A meadowlark finds its home on the ground, he'd told her, his voice a low rumble. It doesn't need a tall tree, just a patch of grass and a wide sky. He gave it to her the week before he passed peacefully in his sleep, leaving Clara alone with his sister's daughter, her Aunt Martha, and her husband, Thomas. Martha and Thomas were practical people. They saw the ranch not as a home, but as an asset, a collection of acreage and livestock to be managed efficiently. They had never understood Elias's quiet ways, his preference for old tools, or the hours he spent teaching Clara things they considered useless for a young woman. They saw Clara as another line item in a ledger, an expense to be managed and, ultimately, eliminated. They tolerated her while Elias was alive. But with him gone, the warmth in the house seemed to vanish overnight, replaced by the chilly air of calculation. The ejection, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, administrative act of cruelty. 2 weeks after the simple burial on the hill overlooking the creek, Aunt Martha called Clara into the parlor. The horsehair furniture was stiff and unwelcoming. Thomas stood by the window, his back to the room, looking out at the land he now controlled. On the polished table between them lay a single sheet of paper and a small stack of bills. "Clara," Martha began, her voice devoid of any warmth, "we have settled your grandfather's estate. The main house, the livestock, and the acreage are, of course, ours. It is what is required to keep the ranch solvent." She paused, her fingers drumming a light, impatient rhythm on the tabletop. "Elias, in his sentimentality, added a codicil to his will for you. He has left you the plot of the old homestead, where the original house stood before the fire. The land itself is only a 1/4 acre, and of course, there is nothing on it but the foundation and the old cellar." She pushed the paper toward Clara. It was a quitclaim deed, simple and stark. By signing, Clara would affirm her inheritance of the ruin and relinquish any and all future claims to the larger estate. "There is also the matter of your settlement," Martha continued, gesturing to the cash. $27. "It is what we feel is fair for your help here over the years." The amount was an insult, less than the price of a good saddle. but it was presented as a final, non-negotiable fact. Clara looked at her aunt's hard, expectant face, and her uncle's rigid back. She knew there was no room for appeal. Arguing would only bring humiliation. She picked up the pen, its nib scratching softly in the silent room, and signed her name. Her hand did not shake. She folded the paper, tucked it into her pocket, and picked up the $27. "I'll be gone by morning," she said, her voice even. Martha gave a slight, satisfied nod. That would be best. Clara turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the only home she had ever known, the coldness of the parlor, a stark contrast to the familiar warmth of the wooden bird pressed against her palm. The journey was not long in distance, perhaps only 2 miles across the open prairie, but it felt like crossing an ocean. Clara left just as the sun was rising, casting long, cool shadows across the grasslands. She carried a single bundle tied with twine, containing a change of clothes, a woolen blanket, a small sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and the heavy iron skillet that had been her grandfather's. Everything else, the books, the furniture, the memories embedded in the walls of the ranch house, was gone to her now. The wind was a constant presence, a steady push against her back, whispering through the tall buffalo grass and carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. The prairie was a sea of subtle color, the pale greens and golds of late summer shifting and swaying in the morning light. In the distance, the mountains were a jagged purple line against a pale blue sky. Her grandfather had taught her to see the beauty in this seeming emptiness, to notice the small things, the way a hawk circled on an updraft, the intricate seed head of a grama grass, the resilient purple flowers of the prairie clover. Today, however, the vastness felt less like freedom and more like a profound and overwhelming loneliness. She was a single, small figure, moving through an immense landscape, her future as unmarked as the sky above. She walked steadily, her boots making a soft, rhythmic crunch on the dry ground. Her grief for Elias was a heavy, solid weight in her chest, a physical ache that came and went in waves. But beneath the grief was a hard, resilient core he had helped to build. She would not cry. She would not despair. She would work. That was the hill way, the way he had taught her. As she crested a small rise, she saw it. The old homestead plot was marked by a stand of 3 gnarled cottonwood trees, their leaves rustling in the wind. In the center of the trees was a darker square of earth, a scar on the land where the old house had been. All that remained visible was the low, crumbling outline of the fieldstone foundation, like the broken teeth of some long-dead animal. It was a place of ruin and abandonment, a testament to fire and loss. To her aunt and uncle, it was worthless. But as Clara drew closer, her eyes tracing the lines of the stone, she felt not despair, but a flicker of something else. It was her own. It was a start. The ruin was exactly as her aunt had described it. A shallow, rectangular pit in the earth, lined with a single course of gray and brown fieldstone, choked with weeds and the charred remnants of timber from the fire that had taken the house decades ago. The fire had happened long before she was born, a story she'd only heard in fragments from her grandfather. A lightning strike, a dry summer, a house gone in an hour. In the center of the foundation, almost flush with the ground, was the cellar door. It was made of 2 thick layers of oak planks, cross-braced with heavy iron straps, gray and weathered but fundamentally solid. A large rusted ring served as a handle. It was not locked, but sealed by time, dirt, and its own immense weight. Clara set down her bundle and skillet and circled the foundation. The stonework was rough but honest, the kind of work a man does with his own 2 hands, using what the land provides. She could see where the fire had blackened the tops of the stones, but the foundation itself was sound. It was a good foundation. She knelt by the cellar door and gripped the iron ring with both hands. She pulled, her muscles straining. Nothing. The door was swollen in its frame, and years of packed dirt had formed a stubborn seal around its edges. She took out the small hand trowel she had tucked into her bundle, another of her grandfather's tools, and began to dig, patiently scraping away the earth from the seams of the door. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher, warming her back. Finally, she had cleared a narrow trench around the entire door. She tried the ring again. This time, with a great groan of protesting wood, the door shifted. She put all her weight into it, pulling backward, and with a final, shuddering scrape, the door lifted open. A wave of cool, damp air washed over her, smelling of earth, stone, and stillness. It was the smell of a place that had been left undisturbed for a very long time. She propped the heavy door open with a piece of charred timber and peered down. A set of steep stone steps led into the darkness. Taking a deep breath, she descended. The cellar was small, no more than 10 feet by 12 feet, with a low ceiling of massive, hand-hewn log joists, the floor supports of the house that had burned above. The walls were lined with the same neat fieldstone as the foundation, and the floor was hard-packed earth, swept clean. It was dry and cool, a refuge from the wind and the sun. Along one wall were empty wooden shelves, their surfaces thick with dust. In the corner, a small stone hearth was built into the wall, with a narrow flue leading up to the ground level. It was more than a cellar. It was a shelter. It was a room. It was the first place that was truly hers. Clara spent the first few days making the cellar habitable. She swept the dust from the shelves and the floor, the rhythmic whisk of her broom a comforting sound in the quiet space. She used her skillet to haul water from the nearby creek, and she patched the few small cracks in the mortar between the stones with a mixture of clay and grass. She laid her blanket on the earthen floor, creating a simple bed. At night, the darkness was absolute, a thick, velvety blackness, broken only by the sliver of starlight visible through the open cellar door. During the day, a rectangle of bright sunlight moved across the floor, a natural clock marking the hours. It was a Spartan existence, but it was peaceful. She felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. Here, there were no cold looks from her aunt, no silent judgment from her uncle. There was only the work of the day and the quiet of the night. On the fourth day, she decided to clean the small hearth. It was clogged with old soot and debris that had fallen down the flue over the years. She shoveled out the ash and loose mortar, her hands and face quickly becoming smudged with black. As she scraped at the packed earth and stone at the base of the hearth, her trowel struck something that wasn't stone. It made a dull, metallic sound. Curious, she dug around the spot. Her fingers found the edge of a flat, smooth stone, different from the rough fieldstones around it. It seemed to be a flagstone, set into the floor of the hearth itself. It was wedged tightly. Using the claw end of her grandfather's hammer, she worked it carefully into a crack at the edge of the stone and pried. With a grating sound, the stone lifted. Beneath it was not dirt, but a hollow space, and nestled inside that space was a tin box, the size of a loaf of bread, its surface dark with age, but free of rust. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She lifted the box out. It was heavy, far heavier than an empty box should be. The lid was not locked, but it was sealed tight. She worked the edge with her knife until it gave with a soft pop. She lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was a thick stack of faded banknotes, tied with a simple string. Beneath them were canvas pouches, and when she loosened the drawstring of the first one, her breath caught. Gold coins, dozens of them, heavy and cool to the touch. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever seen in her life. But beneath the money was something else. A small, leather-bound book and a sealed envelope with the words, "For the one who finds this," written in a steady, elegant hand. She set the money aside and carefully opened the letter. The paper was brittle, the ink faded to a soft brown. The letter began, "My name is Annalise Hill. I built this cellar with my husband Martin in the spring of 1888. If you are reading this, then you are likely family, and you are in need." Clara sat on the earthen floor of the cellar, the rectangle of sunlight falling across the page as she read her great-grandmother's words. "We came to this land with nothing but 2 strong backs and a belief in the promise of the earth," Annalise wrote. "Martin laid these stones, and I mixed the mortar. This cellar was our first home, a dugout where we lived for a year while we built the house above. It was a happy time, but this land asks for a price. A prairie fire took Martin from me 2 years later. I was left alone, with a small son, Elias, and a ranch to run. The fire did not take the house. Not then. That would come later. The people in the town of Sweetgrass said I should sell, that a woman alone could not manage. I refused. I saved every dollar I could, not from fear, but for the future. I buried this box the day my son, Elias, told me he was getting married. I knew he would build his own house, a bigger house, and this place would be left behind. I am leaving this for a day I hope never comes. A day when one of my own might find themselves alone, as I was. A day when they might need a foundation to build upon. The money here is from the sale of cattle over 10 years. It is honestly earned. Use it to build something that will last. Use it to make a life for yourself on this land that I came to love. Be patient. Be steady. The prairie rewards those who endure. Clara's hands trembled as she folded the letter. Elias. Her grandfather had been that small son. He had never spoken of his mother in such detail. He had simply said she was a strong woman. Now Clara understood. She picked up the small leather book. Inside were dozens of pages of pressed prairie flowers, each one carefully preserved and labeled in the same elegant script. Prairie crocus, blue flax, Indian paintbrush. It was a quiet testament to a woman who, like Elias, had paid attention to the small, beautiful things. Annalise had provided not just money, but a connection, a story. Clara was not the first hill woman to be alone on this land. She looked at the gold coins, the worn bills, the faded letter, and the book of flowers. This was more than a discovery. It was an inheritance of spirit. The cellar was no longer just a shelter. It was a legacy. The foundation outside was not just a ruin. It was an invitation. The rebuilding began, not with a hammer, but with a plan. Clara spent 2 days sitting in the shade of the cottonwoods, sketching on the back of a piece of wrapping paper from her supplies. She designed a small, simple house, a single room that would sit perfectly atop the old foundation. It would have a sturdy roof, 2 windows to catch the morning and evening light, and a door that faced east. The cellar would become her larder, and a warm place to sleep until the house was finished. With her plan in hand, she hitched a ride into the town of Sweetgrass with a passing farmer. The town was little more than a dusty main street, with a general store, a blacksmith, and a handful of houses. She walked into the Sweetgrass Mercantile, its bell jingling softly. The proprietor, a man named Silas Croft, was old and stooped, with kind eyes behind thick spectacles. He remembered her grandfather well. Elias Hill's granddaughter, he said, his voice raspy. Heard you were out at the old place. Tough spot. Clara laid her list on the counter. Lumber, nails, roofing tar, window glass, a small cast-iron stove. It was a long list. I have some money, she said, not wanting to reveal how much, and I can work to pay off the rest. Mr. Croft looked at her, then at the list. He saw the determination in her young face, the same steady look Elias had often worn. Your grandfather was an honest man, he said after a moment. His credit is still good here. Take what you need. We'll settle up when you can. It was a profound act of trust, and it settled something deep inside her. The next day, a wagon, loaded with fragrant, fresh-cut pine lumber, arrived at her quarter-acre. The rebuilding could now truly begin. Her first task was to hire the town's stonemason, a gruff, broad-shouldered man named Jedediah Stone. She paid him a fair wage from Annalise's gold to repair and build up the foundation. He worked with a quiet efficiency, chipping and setting the stones, his trowel flashing in the sun. He spoke little, but one afternoon, he paused, wiped his brow, and said, Your grandfather taught me how to square a corner, said a man's character was like a foundation. If it ain't true, nothing you build on it will stand. He looked at the straight, level walls he had built for her. Elias would be proud of this. Once the foundation was ready, Clara's own work began. She worked from sunup to sundown, her body aching with a satisfying fatigue each night. The skills her grandfather had taught her came back as if she had used them every day. She measured and sawed the floor joists, her cuts straight and true. She hammered them into place, the rhythmic thud of her hammer echoing across the prairie. She laid the subfloor, plank by plank, creating a solid, level surface. Then came the walls, framed on the floor, and then raised into place. A difficult and heavy task she managed with levers and sheer willpower. Slowly, miraculously, a house began to take shape against the wide sky. As the structure grew, so did a quiet community around her. People in Sweetgrass began to talk about the hill girl, the one who was single-handedly raising a house from the ashes of the old homestead. They were a reserved people, not given to effusive praise, but they showed their approval in small, practical ways. Jedediah Stone, his work on the foundation long finished, would sometimes ride out at the end of his day to check on her progress, offering a quiet word of advice on bracing a wall or setting a rafter. Sarah Miller, a widow who owned the adjacent plot of land, walked over one afternoon, carrying a covered pot. Inside was a rich, savory beef stew. "A body can't live on flour and coffee," she said simply, her face weathered and kind. She returned a few days later with a handful of seeds for a kitchen garden: beans, squash, and potatoes. She helped Clara turn the soil near the house, her hands moving with the easy familiarity of a lifetime spent working the earth. "This land is stubborn," Sarah told her, pressing a bean seed into the dark soil. "But you give it a little care, and it'll care for you right back." Mr. Croft from the Mercantile sent out a boy with a small crate containing a lantern, a gallon of oil, and a bag of hard candy, with a note that simply said, "For the late nights." These were not acts of charity, but of respect. They saw in Clara the same resilience and self-reliance they valued in themselves. They recognized her as one of their own. Her solitude began to feel less like isolation and more like peaceful independence. She was no longer just the girl cast out by her family. She was becoming Clara Hill of the old Hill Place, a known and respected part of the local landscape. The day she finished the roof was a milestone. She nailed the last strip of tar paper down just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She stood on the peak of her new roof, hammer in hand, and looked out over the vast expanse of the prairie. The wind tugged at her hair, but for the first time, it felt less like a force pushing against her and more like it was holding her up. She could see the light from Sarah Miller's farmhouse twinkling in the distance. Below her was a solid roof, sturdy walls, and a deep cellar full of history and hope. It wasn't a large house, but it was strong, and it was hers. Built not just with wood and nails, but with the quiet support of a community she was slowly, surely, becoming a part of. Winter arrived with a gentle fall of snow that blanketed the prairie in a pristine layer of white. Inside her small house, Clara was warm. The cast-iron stove, a gift to herself with the last of the supply money, glowed with a steady heat, its pipe rising cleanly through the roof she had built. The smell of burning pine and brewing coffee filled the single, cozy room. The two windows she had so carefully set now framed the stark, beautiful landscape of snow and sky. The house was finished. The walls were chinked with a mixture of mud and grass, the floorboards were swept clean, and a simple bed stood in one corner, covered with her woolen blanket and a quilt Sarah Miller had given her. On a small, hand-planed shelf above the hearth sat two objects, side by side. One was the small wooden meadowlark her grandfather had carved, its polished surface reflecting the firelight. The other was her great-grandmother's leather-bound book of pressed flowers. The two objects, made by two people who had loved this land and had provided for her in their own ways, seemed to be in quiet conversation with each other. Clara sat in a simple chair Elias had taught her to make, a cup of warm coffee in her hands, and looked at the life she had built. She thought of her Aunt Martha and Uncle Thomas in their large, cold house, surrounded by assets they could measure, but a home they could not feel. They had given her what they thought was nothing, a ruin, a disgrace, a final dismissal. They had intended to cast her out into the wilderness, to leave her with no foundation upon which to build a life. But they had misjudged the value of things. They had not seen the strength in the old stones, the legacy in the sealed earth, or the resilience in the young woman they had so easily discarded. Her grandfather had left her a piece of land, But her great-grandmother had left her the means to build upon it, and the community had offered the one thing money could not buy: acceptance. Clara Hill was 18 and had been homeless. She had $27 to her name, and with it, she had claimed a ruin. It was the best $27 she ever spent. What we inherit is often more than just land or money. Sometimes, the most valuable legacies are the quiet ones. A skill taught, a story shared, an example of strength that we can draw upon when we find ourselves alone. Clara was given a ruin, but within it, she found the blueprint for her own resilience, left by a woman she never knew, and nurtured by the grandfather she had loved so dearly. Thank you for joining us for her story. We are always so grateful to have you here with us. Let us ask you this, as we leave you to your thoughts. What small, seemingly insignificant inheritance, a piece of advice, a simple tool, a family story, has ended up being a foundation in your own life? We would love to read your reflections in the comments below. Until next time, be well.